In 1960, Canada closed the residential schools. The country told itself that the darkest chapter of its relationship with Indigenous children was over, that the system of forced removal, of taking children from their families, placing them in institutions, punishing them for speaking their own languages, and returning them years later as strangers to the communities that had raised them, was finished. It was not finished. It had simply changed its name. What followed the residential schools was called the 60s Scoop. And what followed the 60s Scoop, continuing into the 1990s, into the 2000s, arguably into the present, has been called the Millennium Scoop. A child welfare system that removed Indigenous children from their families at rates so disproportionate, so consistent, and so specifically targeted that the word accidental does not apply. Canada did not stop taking Indigenous children. It stopped calling it education. It started calling it protection. The harm was the same. The children were the same. The result, a generation separated from their families, their communities, their language, their identity, was the same. Only the paperwork changed. To understand the Millennium Scoop, you have to understand what came before it. The residential school system operated in Canada from the 1880s until the last school closed in 1996. At its peak, it held approximately 150,000 Indigenous children removed from their families, placed in church-run institutions funded by the federal government, forbidden to speak their languages or practice their cultures, and subjected to conditions of neglect, abuse, and in thousands of documented cases, violence. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which concluded its work in 2015, documented over 4,000 children who died in residential schools. The actual number is believed to be significantly higher. Many deaths were never recorded. Many records were destroyed. Many graves remained unmarked until communities began conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys of former school sites in 2021 and found hundreds of previously unknown burials. The residential school system is now widely acknowledged as a cultural genocide. The Canadian government has said so. The Pope has said so. The finding is not contested. But the system's end did not mean the end of the pattern. When the schools closed, the child welfare system expanded to fill the space they had left. And it filled that space in ways that, to the communities experiencing it, felt indistinguishable from what had come before. Beginning in the early 1960s, provincial child welfare agencies began removing Indigenous children from their families in numbers that had no precedent in non-Indigenous communities. The removals were conducted under child welfare legislation, laws that authorized the state to remove children from homes deemed unsafe or neglectful. The legislation was not explicitly targeted at Indigenous people, but its application was. Social workers, almost universally white, with no training in Indigenous cultures or languages, operating with no understanding of how Indigenous communities organized family life and child rearing, entered reserve communities and assessed what they found against a standard of middle-class white domesticity. What they found failed that standard consistently. Poverty, overcrowding, homes without running water or adequate heating, extended family arrangements that looked to outside eyes like neglect. What they failed to understand or failed to consider relevant was that the poverty they were documenting was itself the product of colonial policy, that the communities they were entering had been stripped of their land, their economic base, their governing structures, and their children by the very government that was now sending social workers to assess the damage and remove more children. Between the early 1960s and the mid-1980s, an estimated 20,000 Indigenous children were removed from their families and placed with white families. In Canada, in the United States, and in some cases in Europe, they were adopted out of their communities, out of their cultures, out of their languages, into families and countries that had no connection to who they were or where they came from. The 60s Scoop eventually attracted public attention. Legal challenges were mounted. Some provinces introduced reforms. The discourse around Indigenous child welfare began, slowly, inadequately, to shift. But the removals did not stop. By the 1990s and 2000s, the period that gives the Millennium Scoop its name, Indigenous children were being removed from their families at rates that had not decreased from the 60s scoop. In some provinces, the rates had increased. In Manitoba in the early 2000s, Indigenous children represented approximately 70% of children in government care, while Indigenous people represented approximately 15% of the province's population. In British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the same pattern. Indigenous children dramatically overrepresented in care. Non-Indigenous children dramatically underrepresented. The disproportionality was not subtle. It was not a statistical artifact. It was a consistent, documented, province-wide pattern that persisted across decades, across different governments, across different policy frameworks. And at the center of it was the same mechanism that had driven the residential schools and the 60s scoop. A child welfare system that assessed Indigenous family life against a standard it was structurally incapable of meeting because the conditions producing the apparent deficiencies were themselves the product of colonial underfunding that the same government controlled. In 2007, a human rights complaint was filed with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on behalf of First Nations children. The complaint alleged that the federal government was providing significantly less funding for child welfare services on reserves than provinces provided for equivalent services off reserves. That the underfunding was chronic, documented, and directly contributing to the removal of children because communities without adequate family support services were more likely to have children apprehended, and the government responsible for funding those services was systematically providing less of them to the communities that needed them most. The tribunal ruled in favor of the complainants in 2016. It found that the federal government had been discriminating against First Nations children by underfunding child welfare services on reserves. It ordered the government to cease the discriminatory practice and to provide equitable funding. The government appealed the ruling multiple times, while continuing during the appeals process to underfund the services it had been found to be discriminatorily underfunding. The legal process continued for years. The children continued to be removed, the funding gap continued to exist, and the Government of Canada, a government that had issued formal apologies for the residential schools, that had committed to reconciliation, that used the language of partnership and healing in its public communications, spent years in court fighting a ruling that said it needed to spend more money on Indigenous children's welfare. The apologies and the litigation were happening simultaneously, in the same country, under the same government. The research on what happens to children removed from their families and communities is consistent and has been consistent for decades. Children separated from their families of origin, particularly when that separation is involuntary, sudden, and places them in an unfamiliar cultural environment, experience significantly elevated rates of mental health difficulties, of attachment disorders, of substance abuse in adolescence and adulthood, of involvement with the criminal justice system, of homelessness, of suicide. For Indigenous children specifically, the research adds another dimension. Children removed from Indigenous communities and placed with non-Indigenous families lose access to their language, their cultural practices, their connection to the land and the community that gave those practices meaning. They grow up belonging in full to neither world, not to the non-Indigenous families that raised them, and not to the communities they came from, because they were taken before they had the chance to learn what belonging to those communities meant. The term used in the literature is cultural discontinuity. It is a clinical phrase for something that does not feel clinical to the people experiencing it. It feels like not knowing who you are, like being from somewhere you have never been, like carrying an identity that nobody around you shares or understands. Thousands of Millennium Scoop children carry this, right now. In Canadian cities on reserves they were separated from as infants, in countries they were adopted to as toddlers and have spent their adult lives trying to understand. The human rights complaint that was filed in 2007 was filed in part by a woman named Cindy Blackstock. Blackstock is the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She is also a member of the Gitxsan Nation, and she is, by any measure, one of the most persistent advocates for Indigenous children's rights in Canadian history. After the 2016 tribunal ruling found the federal government guilty of discrimination, Blackstock continued to monitor compliance. When the government appealed, when it delayed, when it implemented changes that fell short of what the ruling required, when it argued in court that the amounts owed in compensation to affected children should be capped, legally limited, to reduce the government's financial exposure. Blackstock documented all of it. She appeared before committees, she gave interviews, she filed follow-up complaints. She did not stop. In 2021, the federal government announced a settlement of approximately $40 billion, one of the largest in Canadian history, to compensate First Nations children who had been removed from their families and to reform the child welfare system going forward. The settlement is real, the money is real, and Cindy Blackstock's response to it was precise. The settlement matters, the reform matters, and neither one returns a single day to a single child who grew up without their family. The accounting can be settled, the time cannot. Across Canada, there are adults who were removed from Indigenous families as infants or young children, placed with non-Indigenous families, and who have spent significant portions of their adult lives searching for where they came from. Some have found their birth families. Some have arrived to find that their mothers and fathers have died, that the search ended not in reunion, but in the discovery of what they missed and can never recover. Some have found siblings they never knew existed, other children removed from the same family, scattered across different provinces, sometimes across different countries, who grew up as strangers to each other and are meeting for the first time as adults. Some have found their communities and discovered that their language, the language their grandparents spoke, that their parents spoke before the removal, is endangered, that there are only a handful of fluent speakers left, that the connection they are trying to rebuild is to something that is itself in the process of disappearing. And some have found nothing. The records are incomplete. The adoptions were closed. The names were changed. The trail ends somewhere in a filing cabinet in a provincial government office, behind a privacy law that was not designed with the needs of adopted Indigenous people in mind. These are not edge cases. They are the ordinary experience of thousands of people, right now, in Canada. As of the most recent available data, Indigenous children represent approximately 53% of children in foster care in Canada. Indigenous people represent approximately 5% of Canada's total population. The overrepresentation, Indigenous children 5% of the population, 53% of children in care, is the largest such disparity of any identifiable group in any child welfare system in the developed world. It has not meaningfully decreased in 30 years. The 2021 settlement, the 2016 tribunal ruling, the apologies for the residential schools, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the declarations of commitment to reconciliation from every level of government. And still, 53%. The gap between what Canada says about Indigenous children and what Canada does about Indigenous children is not a gap that can be explained by good intentions imperfectly executed. It is a gap that requires a different explanation, one that the official language of reconciliation has consistently failed to provide. In 2007, the same year the human rights complaint was filed, the Canadian Parliament unanimously passed a resolution called Jordan's Principle. Jordan's Principle was named for Jordan River Anderson, a young First Nations boy from Norway House Cree Nation in Manitoba who was born with complex medical needs and spent the first years of his life in a Winnipeg hospital, not because his medical needs required hospitalization, but because the federal and provincial governments could not agree on which of them was responsible for funding his home care. Jordan died in the hospital in 2005 at the age of 5. He never spent a single night in a family home. Jordan's Principle established that when a jurisdictional dispute arises over services for a First Nations child, the government of first contact must pay for the service immediately and resolve the jurisdictional dispute afterward. The child's needs come first. The paperwork comes second. The principle was unanimously endorsed by Parliament. It was then implemented inadequately, inconsistently, and in ways that required years of follow-up litigation to enforce. A principle named for a child who died because governments couldn't agree on who should pay for his care was itself subsequently fought over by governments disagreeing about how to implement it. Jordan River Anderson has been dead for 20 years. The dispute his death was supposed to end is still not fully resolved. When a child is removed from an Indigenous community as an infant and placed with a non-Indigenous family, one of the things lost, immediately, irrecoverably, is language. Canada has approximately 70 Indigenous language groups, comprising over 630 distinct languages and dialects. Of these, the majority are endangered, many are critically endangered, spoken fluently by only a handful of elders. Some have already been lost entirely. Language loss is not simply a cultural inconvenience. Language encodes a way of understanding the world, relationships, obligations, connections to land and community and history that does not translate fully into English or French. When a language dies, the knowledge it carried dies with it. The residential schools targeted language explicitly. Children were punished for speaking their own languages, sometimes severely. The child welfare system targeted it structurally, by removing children from the communities where the language was spoken before they had learned it. The effect was the same, the mechanism was different. The residential schools used punishment. The child welfare system used geography. Both worked. Both are still working, and the languages are still disappearing. For Indigenous children who enter the foster care system and are not adopted, who move through a series of placements, sometimes dozens of placements over the course of a childhood, the experience is one of sustained instability that the research literature describes as profoundly damaging. Frequent placement changes disrupt schooling. They sever whatever peer relationships have begun to form. They teach children, through repeated experience, that attachment to adults is temporary and unreliable, a lesson that reshapes how the brain processes relationships and threat in ways that persist long after the placements have ended. Indigenous children in the foster system are also at significantly elevated risk of experiencing abuse within the system itself. The placements are not always safe, the oversight is not always adequate, and children who have been removed from their families, who are already in a system that has defined their home of origin as unsafe, have limited practical ability to report harm in a new placement and be believed. The system that was designed to protect these children has, in documented and repeated cases, failed to protect them, sometimes catastrophically. And the children who age out of the foster system at 18, who become legally adults and therefore no longer the responsibility of the child welfare system, frequently have no family network to return to, no community connection, no housing, and no support of any kind. The residential schools produced the same outcome: children institutionalized, then released into a world they were unprepared for, with no support structure waiting on the other side. The pipeline from foster care to homelessness, to addiction, to incarceration is not a metaphor in Indigenous communities. It is a documented pathway that generations of children have traveled, and it begins with removal. The word reconciliation appears constantly in Canadian public discourse about Indigenous people. It appears in government documents, in corporate mission statements, in school curricula, in the speeches of politicians at every level. It has become one of the most commonly used words in the Canadian political vocabulary. What it has not become is a description of something that has actually happened. Reconciliation, genuine reconciliation, not the performative kind, would require Canada to look honestly at the 53% figure and ask what produced it, to look at the funding gap and close it, to look at the legal battles over Jordan's principle and stop fighting them, to look at the communities where languages are dying and fund their revitalization at the scale the crisis requires. It would require Canada to stop treating Indigenous child welfare as a jurisdictional problem, a dispute between federal and provincial governments about who pays, and start treating it as a moral emergency that overrides the administrative convenience of both. None of this is impossible. None of it requires technology that doesn't exist or resources that aren't available. It requires political will. It requires the willingness to spend money on Indigenous children at the same rate that money is spent on non-Indigenous children. It requires treating the documented harm as the emergency it is. Canada has not done this. Despite the apologies, despite the settlements, despite the commissions and the inquiries and the declarations and the land acknowledgements, Canada has not done this. The 53% remains. Somewhere in Canada tonight, there is an Indigenous child in a foster home. The child may be an infant, maybe a toddler, maybe 7 or 10 or 15. The child's family, the mother, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles and cousins who would have raised that child in the community it came from, is somewhere else, separated by a system that decided on the basis of criteria that have been found discriminatory by a federal tribunal that the home was not safe. The residential schools are closed. The 60s scoop has been apologized for. The settlements are being negotiated and in some cases paid. And the child is still in the foster home. Because what Canada has never fully grappled with is that the residential schools and the 60s scoop and the millennium scoop are not separate policies. They are the same policy, adapted across generations to fit the administrative and legal language of their time. The goal, the separation of Indigenous children from Indigenous families, communities, cultures, and languages, has never changed. Only the paperwork has changed. This is dark Canada, where the pattern that was supposed to have ended gets followed all the way to the present day. Subscribe, because the history didn't end. It's still happening, and somebody has to say so.